The Egyptian Empire, one of the oldest civilizations in recorded history, dates back 5,000 years. The pharaohs who ruled this vast empire were considered gods. In life, they were omnipotent, and in death, they were reborn into an eternal afterlife. For use in this afterlife, the pharaohs' bodies were mummified, and they were entombed in enormous pyramids, along with everything they might need on their journey. But these impressive pyramids acted like beacons for ancient thieves who found their way inside and stole the pharaoh's treasure. So the pharaohs abandoned the pyramids and concealed their tombs in a remote valley. But even this, Valley of the Kings as it became known, was discovered and the tombs ransacked. This proved extremely frustrating for archaeologists who began digging in the valley in the 1800s. Decades of work had failed to reveal a single unplundered royal tomb. That all changed in 1922, when archaeologist Howard Carter made a spectacular discovery. It was the tomb of a little-known pharaoh, Tutankhamun. Howard Carter was born in 1873 and grew up in Norfolk, England. Like his father, he was a gifted artist. While still a teenager, Carter was hired by the Egyptian Exploration Fund to draw illustrations of their discoveries, and in 1890, Howard Carter left for Egypt on his first archaeological expedition. In Egypt, Carter quickly made a name for himself. He was meticulous and conscientious, and his watercolors were considered the best in the business.
Here he really did excel. He had the patience and the talent to make drawings that literally come alive. They have not just a technical accuracy to them, but clearly Carter was sympathetic to his subject. Clearly he understood it. They have that three-dimensional look that really did make his drawings, I think, among some of the finest that were done in the early 20th century.
Even so, Carter had bigger ambitions. He wanted to become an archaeologist himself and lead his own expedition in the Valley of the Kings. To that end, Carter dedicated himself to his work. He learned Arabic, taught himself how to read hieroglyphics, and he built close relationships with his Egyptian workers. In 1904, the Egyptian government took notice and hired him to oversee all archaeological activities along the Nile Valley. Carter was thrilled and he excelled in his position, but his difficult personality and quick temper would soon get in the way. Not long after taking the job, Carter reluctantly became involved in a scuffle with some drunken tourists. When he refused to apologize, the Egyptian Antiquities Service fired him.
Carter was not the kind of person to back down, not the kind of person to apologize if he said something on the spur of the moment. And as a consequence, Carter found himself more often than not in difficult positions of his own making.
For the next few years, he scraped by conducting guided tours of Egyptian monuments and selling watercolors to tourists. He had no money and no prospects. But in 1907, his luck changed. He was introduced to George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon was born at Highclere Castle to a life of wealth and privilege.
He loved racehorses. He loved, at one point he drove fast cars. He liked to travel around. He liked partying. He had been brought up totally spoiled. Amounts of money that didn't matter. You know, he never looked at what the balance sheet was.
An adventurer and amateur historian, in the early 1900s, Lord Carnarvon began wintering in Egypt, and it was here he developed an interest in archaeology. The Earl had money, but he needed someone with experience. Howard Carter had experience and was desperate for money.
Carter was in need of a benefactor to subsidize his work, in part because he was having difficulty finding people who wanted to work with him, given his temperament. And Carnarvon was perfectly willing to have someone out there excavating, particularly in a spot as exciting as the Valley of the Kings, where there very well might be great and exciting discoveries to be made.
In fact, Carter believed the valley still held one undiscovered tomb. Over the years, archaeologists had found a number of artifacts inscribed with the name Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh who ascended the throne as a young man and who died while still a teenager. No one had ever found Tutankhamun's tomb, and Carter persuaded Lord Carnarvon to take up the search. For 6 years, Carter worked in searing desert heat under conditions that were often dangerous, and Carter removed nearly 200,000 tons of rock and debris from the valley floor, but he came up almost empty-handed. In 1922, Lord Carnarvon decided he'd had enough.
After 6 dry seasons, the donor was beginning to be highly skeptical and said, look, really, maybe we should admit that all of the dreams are not going to come to fulfillment and there's nothing there.
But Carter was tenacious, and in the end, the Earl gave in and agreed to fund one more season of work. So Carter returned to the Valley of the Kings for his last chance to find the tomb of Tutankhamun.
His greatest strength was his unflagging persistence. Howard Carter believed, and he went, and he knew he was going to find it, and he found it.
On the morning of November 4th, 1922, Carter arrived at the site and found his workmen surprisingly idle. The night before, they had uncovered a single stone step cut into the bedrock of the valley floor, and they were eagerly waiting for Carter before going any further. One step at a time for 5 days, they uncovered an entire staircase and finally found a blocked doorway. Carter wrote about what was going through his mind in his memoirs.
It was a thrilling moment for an excavator. Alone, save for my native workmen, I found myself, after years of comparatively unproductive labor, on the threshold of what might prove to be a magnificent discovery. Anything, literally anything, might lie beyond that passage, and it needed all my self-control to keep from breaking down the doorway and investigating then and there.
He summoned Lord Carnarvon, and with him by his side, Carter made a dramatic discovery. On the lower portion of the doorway, he found the royal seal of Tutankhamun. At long last, Carter had found the tomb he'd been searching for. But with this unbelievable discovery came terrible disappointment. A moment later, Carter found evidence that the tomb had already been opened and resealed. It was possible that after all his years of backbreaking work, Carter would come up empty-handed after all. For several days, he nervously looked on as his workers cleared the entrance to the tomb. On November 26, 1922, Carter looked into Tutankhamun's tomb for the first time.
As my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. I was struck with amazement, and when Lord Carnarvon, unable to stand the suspense any longer, inquired anxiously, "Can you see anything?" it was all I could do to get out the words, "Yes, wonderful things."
When he peered through the doorway and he said, "Yes, wonderful things," I think that's one of the most remarkable understatements in archaeological history. Even in old 1920 black and white prints, it's absolutely staggering. Gold furniture, gold statuettes, huge pieces of carved alabaster, jewelry, boxes, and animal-shaped containers filled with foodstuffs, the whole array of funerary goods.
Carter realized that he wasn't the first to enter the tomb. But the looters who preceded him hadn't gotten very far. They'd left behind a whole museum full of spectacular objects. But an important question remained unanswered. Had the looters left behind Tutankhamun's mummy? Carter turned his attention to a blocked doorway guarded by 2 life-sized statues. Anxiously, he removed a few stones and went through feet first. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Carter saw an enormous wooden shrine magnificently carved and layered in gold. Carefully, Carter opened the shrine's massive doors. Inside, he found another pair of carved doors, and these were held closed by a simple braided rope and the intact royal seal of Tutankhamun. To Carter, this was a sure sign that the shrine contained Tutankhamun's mummy, untouched since the ancient Egyptian priests had buried him more than 3,000 years before. But looking at the mummy would have to wait. Dismantling the huge shrine was far more than the two of them could handle then and there, so Carter and Carnarvon closed the doors and prepared to mount a world-class excavation. Lord Carnarvon would never live to see inside the shrine. Less than 5 months after the tomb's opening, Carter's friend and benefactor fell ill from an infected mosquito bite, and within weeks, he died. Newspapers attributed the Earl's untimely death to a curse, and the bizarre rumor took on a life of its own. Carter did his best to ignore the rumor. As far as he was concerned, the death of Lord Carnarvon was simply a tragic event. What Carter couldn't ignore was the clamor his discovery had created. Howard Carter and Tutankhamun's treasure had become news around the world, and every day a crowd of reporters and tourists gathered at the entrance to the tomb, wanting a glimpse inside.
There used to be long lines, and they'd hang around to see everything was taken out of the tomb. They were there to look at it, and it drove him nuts.
Soon, a wave of Tut mania began spreading through both Europe and the United States.
Warning, the mummy is here. Words that need no explanation to moviegoers of a generation.
The mummy, the mummy's curse, the mummy's hand, the bride of the mummy, Abbott and Costello meet the mummy, all of these things coming out one after another, fueled this almost frenzy of interest about ancient Egypt. Everybody had to have Egyptian motifs in their home. Everything from jewelry containers to pieces of furniture. I think it's very difficult to underestimate the importance of Tutankhamun, not as an ancient king, but in his role as a 20th century icon.
Howard Carter had very little interest in dealing with the press or the demands of celebrity. He just wanted to get back to work.
This was a time when a great deal of diplomacy and tact was called for, and unfortunately Carter just said, "I have things to do, I am an archaeologist, go away and leave me alone."
Despite the many distractions, Carter remained committed to methodically archiving and removing the tomb's contents. And he brought in a team of specialists to help mount a thorough excavation of the site. There were a total of 4 rooms: the annex, antechamber, treasury, and burial chamber, and each was piled high with treasure. And Carter insisted that not a single artifact could be moved before being thoroughly examined, well documented, and restored.
To give some idea of the incredible work that it entailed to get this stuff out, they found sandals with beads, hundreds and hundreds of beads, but the thread was just on the edge of going. So if they touched them, the whole thing there would be no sandal left. So they had to restring them before they fell apart.
I could think of several other excavators at the time who, had they been the ones to find the tomb of Tutankhamun, might simply have gone in and taken the objects out and said, "Aren't these beautiful pieces?" He was convinced that meticulous recording was essential if we were going to learn as much as possible from objects, careful photographic records of every object in situ, careful drawings and measurements of every object showing exactly where each piece lay in relation to every other piece were made. The work that he and his staff engaged in was, well, for the time, world-class.
After more than a year of work, the time finally came for Carter to open Tutankhamun's burial shrine. Nervously, Carter sliced the braided rope, opened the doors, and peered inside. There he found 2 more ornately carved shrines nested one inside the other. And finally, Carter found Tutankhamun's 9-foot-long sarcophagus. In February of 1924, Carter lifted the massive stone lid and looked inside. He described the decisive moment himself in this BBC recording.
Light shone into the sarcophagus. The contents were completely covered by linen shrouds. But as the last shroud was rolled back, a gasp of wonderment escaped our lips. So gorgeous was the sight that met our eyes. A golden effigy of the young king of magnificent workmanship filled the whole of the interior.
But in his hour of triumph, Howard Carter's stubbornness would once again get him into trouble. Eager to reward his team, Carter wanted to invite the families of his workers into the tomb to have a first look. But the Egyptian Office of Antiquities insisted that dignitaries and government officials be allowed in first. Carter was furious.
He was known to be a man of some smoldering temper. And then when he broke, bango, it was like a volcano. There's an Egyptian expression called malesh. And people are getting into an argument. People come over and say malesh. Everybody calms down. It means, hey, cool it. And he had none of that. You couldn't say malesh to Howard Carter.
Impulsively, he closed the tomb down, cut the power lines, locked the gates, and walked away. But Carter had badly misread the situation. Instead of giving in to him, the Egyptians installed their own locks and barred Carter from the tomb. Their move stunned him. After several attempts to resolve this situation, Carter reluctantly left Egypt, not sure if he'd ever return. He toured America lecturing, but his unfinished work in the Valley of the Kings weighed on him. In 1926, after more than a year of formal negotiations, a compromise was reached, and a greatly relieved Howard Carter returned to the Valley of the Kings and his work in Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Carter now removed the outer coffin's enormous golden lid, revealing a second, even more magnificent coffin. This one also bore the likeness of the pharaoh. Inside, Carter found a third. It was 6 feet long, weighed nearly 300 pounds, and was made of solid gold. Inside this last coffin, Carter found the most impressive of all the tomb's treasures, a breathtaking life-sized gold mask surrounding the pharaoh's head and shoulders.
This mask is in the top 10 of all works of art that have survived all of civilization. It is so perfectly made and so moving and so human. The artist not only made a godhead, which is totally idealistic, but he also made a vulnerable 12 or 13-year-old boy. And it's both in there, and you can see them both at the same time.
But why was this short-lived and virtually unknown king buried with this incredible warehouse full of treasure?
Intriguingly, the only reason he had all those objects in his tomb, probably, is because he died unexpectedly, and they had not decorated the walls of a tomb. And therefore, they had to put certain burial scenes in the tomb in order to ensure that he could travel from this life to the next. And in addition, it was a good way to get rid of the last vestiges of the period art that people wanted to destroy. They just threw it all into King Tut's tomb, closed the door, and went away.
After he removed the gold mask, Carter unwrapped the pharaoh's linen-covered body and examined more than 140 ornaments, amulets, and pieces of jewelry that were inside the coffin. And when the last of the bandages were set aside, Howard Carter finally came face to face with the emaciated mummy of Tutankhamun.
In his career, he's now had 2 one-of-a-kinds of all of the history of archaeology. The entrance into a relatively intact tomb, and the other when he takes off the final wrappings and sees the dried out but very human-looking face of this young boy who was the ruler of the then universe. Can you imagine?
Many questions remain about Tutankhamun, and none have intrigued scholars more than the circumstances surrounding the young pharaoh's death. Why did this teenaged king die so young? Despite a thorough examination, Carter and his team came away with more questions than answers.
When he gets down to the examination of the body itself and how this young man died, all it did was to foment dozens of theories.
There is a theory more recently espoused that he was murdered because there's a small hole in the back of Tutankhamun's skull. Some people think this is due to a blow to the head. Other people think it was an accident during the embalming process. And still others think that it is something that occurred even later than that.
Over the years, scientists have continued to investigate, but to this day the question remains unanswered. In total, Carter and his team spent 10 years numbering, cataloging, preserving, photographing, and removing the nearly 5,000 artifacts from the tomb's 4 burial chambers. Finally, Carter rewrapped Tutankhamun's mummy, placed him back inside his sarcophagus, and returned the pharaoh to his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The boy king remains there to this day. In 1932, with his work in the tomb of Tutankhamun finally finished, Carter left Egypt and returned to England. Over the next few years, he wrote his memoirs, dealt in antiquities, and lectured, but he never conducted another excavation. In 1939, Howard Carter died virtually forgotten. He was 66 years old. Like Tutankhamun, Howard Carter has become more famous in death than he was in life. His legacy of total dedication and methodical record-keeping helped set the modern standard for archaeology, and Carter's larger-than-life discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun remains unique and unequaled.
You can't pick up a book today on ancient Egypt written for a general population that doesn't say the greatest excavation since Tutankhamun or what. It's become the benchmark whereby we judge everything now that's being done in archaeology. Is it as good as, is it as big as, is it as rich as King Tut's tomb?